Ja,
jouw opmerking was echt raak. Ik zat vanochtend in een vergadering, mensen stelden vragen over andere zaken. Sorry, ik doe het nog niet.
Professors are sitting over there.
Alsjeblieft, enig begrip.
It says it's reserved, but I think it should be for parents.
Voor Europa ook. Ja,
Ja, gewoon whatever. What happened? Not yet. No, it says reserved, but I don't know if it says reserved, but
niet samen kunnen werken.
Yes, escape or the next one, not this good, but escape. It looks really dangerous. I was in Dubai, it was taking me the gravel on the side of the I can't do it, but
Maar kijk, het is natuurlijk een combinatie. Ja, dat kan je ook wel zo maken. The battle of photography.
According to the customs of this university, we open this academic session with a prayer. Spiritus Sancti Gratia, illuminet sensus et corda nostra. Amen. Please take a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here at Radboud University, Nijmegen. Either here in this room, or connected via Zoom, or following the ceremony via live stream. Of course, a special word for you, Mr. Nalantigal, and the people who are entitled to assist you in defense of your thesis. Ms. Baladari, Ms. Kiratamurti, and Mr. Krishamuga. Welcome to all of you in this academic session. In turn, I will present the members of the examination board. Before that, I already present three persons, the supervisors of this thesis. Dr. Strik, Professor Van Hout, who will be here on Zoom, and Dr. Herma from Philips Research. They are not going to ask any questions, as they already asked a number of questions during the last couple of years, I assume. So now I give the floor to the candidate for the degree of doctor.
With the permission of the doctoral board, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled Respiratory Health Sensing from Speech. So let's try to understand the physiological aspects of speech. Speech is a complex behavior. It involves various systems like cognitive system, respiratory system, muscular system, etc. Cognitive system because we need to have a language model ready and the logic or planning for speaking. Respiratory system, often not realized, but is the basis for speech production. We inhale a gulp of air, and while exhaling, we articulate speech. Muscular system, because we need to have all the muscles involved in phonation and articulation working fine. Not just in phonation and articulation, but also the muscles involved in lungs for respiration should also be working fine. And they need to be a perfect synchrony among all these systems. And any lapse in this synchrony among various systems will lead to a disorder which will be manifested in one's speech. For example, if there's a cognitive dysfunction, that would lead to language disorders like Parkinson, dementia, etc. Similarly, if there's a dysfunction of excitation or articulation, it would lead to speech disorders like dysarthria, aphasia, etc. Hence, speech is a potential biomarker. And the main advantages of using speech as a potential biomarker is it's non-invasive, it's cost-effective, so it's easy to collect speech recordings, and this could be used in remote health monitoring services like telehealth services, wherein a customer usually wears a wearable pendant or a watch, and in case of necessity, they just press a button and it connects to the call center agent, and they talk. These conversations can be recorded and analyzed to detect various pathological conditions. This is much more relevant to respiratory conditions, as we often hear respiratory discomfort when a person with respiratory disease talk. So now, let's try to understand the relationship between speech and respiration. Speech and respiration are highly interdependent, mainly because the source organ is the same, that is lungs. Humans have somehow mastered the smart utilization of lungs over evolution. Not just over evolution, there's quite a lot of morphological development of vocal tract from infants to an adult. So every time we speak, we inhale a gulp of air, and while exhaling, we control the flow of breath by applying a pressure at the glottal area and articulate speech. So speech can be visualized as a systematic outflow of air based on the linguistic content and prosodic factors. I say linguistic content because if an utterance has too many vowels, for example like e, or fricatives like f, s, then we tend to lose a lot of air and we are in a necessity for taking a next breath. Similarly, I say prosodic factors because if a person speaks too loudly, they also run out of breath and they need to take the next breath. So speech can be seen as a Yeah, and to establish this relationship, we need to develop speech breathing models and do breathing analysis on speech. So the major part of our research is in developing speech breathing models for sensing breathing signal from speech. And this work is one of the first few studies in sensing respiration from speech, and it's published in major conferences, and we got a wide attention in the speech research community. For building such a model, we first need a database of respiratory signal with speech. So at Philips, we collected 40 healthy volunteers' data using two sensors, the respiratory inductive belt sensor, which is worn over the chest and abdomen, which measures the expansion and contraction of chest and abdomen, and the sum is taken as a breathing signal, and a microphone to record the speech. And in speech breathing patterns, the breath events are usually a sudden peak, as you can see in the second graph, and that happens during inhalation, and it's followed by a gradual decline during exhalation. As you can see, again, speech is a complex signal, and it's not very evident to understand the relationship with breathing signal. However, as I discussed earlier, the underlying relation is dependent on the linguistic content and prosodic factors. Modeling such relationship is a challenging problem and hence wasn't much explored earlier. However, deep learning enables us to learn this relationship. So this is how a speech breathing pattern looks like. Here in the first signal, it's the audio signal being recorded from the microphone. And the second signal is the breathing signal, breathing pattern, which is measured by the respiratory inductive plethysmography belt signal. So in speech breathing patterns, as I mentioned earlier, the breath events are usually a sudden peak, which is the inhalation movement, followed by a gradual descending curve, which is exhalation. So our research was mainly in estimating the breathing signal directly from speech. So as you can see here, the red signal is the estimated breathing signal, which is pretty close to the measured breathing signal. We could achieve a correlation of 0.562, a breathing rate error of 5.89%, tidal volume error of 10.21%, and breathing event sensitivity of 91.6%, which is considered to be very accountable. Next, the study we addressed is respiratory difficulty or shortness of breath detection. Here, the problem we are trying to solve is if we have a historical speech recordings of a person, and if a new speech recording is given, we wanted the model to detect if the recording is better or worse in condition. For respiratory conditions, shortness of breath can be tracked over multiple recordings, and that could give an idea about the improvement or deterioration of condition. This is especially much more relevant to conditions like COVID-19 and chronic lung diseases like COPD. Again, here we could achieve an accuracy of 74.04% in detecting respiratory difficulty when a 1-minute recording is used, whereas for a 8 seconds recording, we could achieve accuracy of 68.25%. Thus, longer recordings provide better accuracy in detecting respiratory difficulty. Next, we try to also apply our speech breathing models to detect COPD. This is an application for what we've been working on. COPD is a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is one of the major diseases creating a huge burden on global healthcare. So more than 65 million people suffer from COPD, and $49 billion being spent in COPD-related patient care. 90% of COPD deaths occur in low and middle income countries, and 3.2 million people died from COPD worldwide in 2015 alone. So the main reasons why COPD occurs is through excessive smoking, polluted environments, and genetical disorders. And the major symptoms are coughing, wheezing, and respiratory discomfort. So here we used our speech breathing models to estimate the breathing signal, and thus the breathing rate could be computed from the breathing signal, and we observed a clear distinction in the breathing rates for healthy subjects and subjects with COPD. Also, we observed that the average breathing rate for stable condition is much lesser than the breathing rate for exacerbation conditions. Thus, breathing rate estimated from a speech breathing model could be used as an important parameter for COPD exacerbation detection. So the major conclusions today from our work was we can assess respiratory health from speech directly, and respiratory pattern and thus respiratory parameters can be estimated directly from speech using deep learning techniques. Respiratory difficulty can be detected by computing difference in shortness of breath in two recordings, and this gives insights of improvement or deterioration of a condition. And speech can be used as a modality for detecting COPD exacerbation. So AI and voice technology will transform healthcare is what we envision in. Personal health monitoring conversational agents are already a need of an hour, and I'm pretty confident that our research will be part of this transformation. Thank you. Having presented this summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Larsen, Chair of the Manuscript Committee.
Esteemed candidate, thank you for your interesting and informative and compelling presentation. With your thesis, we have seen a glimpse of the future of AI and the future of medical diagnosis. As a first question, I'd like to ask you something about the future. So we're very hopeful for the advances that this technology can bring, and if it's used in a widespread way. But we're also concerned about ways in which it might possibly be misused. So let's stop as the first question to think a little bit about the ethical aspects of your research. Could you please tell us about what ethical concerns that the research that you have done might raise and how they could be addressed?
Yeah. So speech, as we all know, is an identity for a person. So that's on stake when we are actually having their recordings in a database. So extra care has to be taken on these recordings. The purpose of the recordings should always be present already while recording them. There should be a proper informed consent every time speech is being recorded. And also the utilization of these speech recordings for whatever the technology that we are developing should also be clearly informed. And this is very important, especially, yeah, as I said, it's the identity of a person.
Okay. Thank you. So you mentioned informed consent, which is indeed extremely important. Given the application scenario, how are you going to gather informed consent? And during diagnosis, is the recording that you mentioned, strictly speaking, necessary?
I mean, could you repeat if you don't mind?
So you sketched a scenario in which somebody is speaking to a diagnostician who's then analyzing their speech to understand if their condition has deteriorated. And you just mentioned that every time that you make a recording, you want to get informed consent. And I wanted to invite you to think a little bit about how that would work in the particular scenario that you sketched.
First letting the person know that we are collecting the data and storing them is very important. But for researchers like us, wherein we are computing AI models, we are designing or modeling AI models on the speech, we are not directly working on speech most of the times. We try to do some feature extraction first and then change it to a domain wherein it's not reversible to the speech, so that certain privacy aspects of the person could already be diminished. And we inform all this to the person while taking the data, that the data would be recorded when they are actually using the technology, but later this would be converted into a different domain which would not be reversible. And only if they accept for the consent, that's when we use it in our technologies.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned that you're concerned about the fact that speech is a bearer of a person's identity. Which other information in speech might you be concerned about falling into the wrong hands?
If the speech contains personal data, for example, if they are revealing about their age, for example, or their sexual orientation or political views or anything of that kind, anything that actually describes about the person during the conversations, that's also an important privacy aspect for the person. So we try to, at least in our speech recordings, that when the database that we've been collecting, we usually inform the person that all these kind of things has to be taken care of. We give them a pre-notioned idea that they shouldn't be talking about any personal data. And yeah.
So what should we be most worried about moving forward?
Obviously when a person is donating or when they're giving their speech for technology, they're always worried about if any condition comes up, would it be reversible or would they be identifiable for that particular disease, for example. So I believe that when you are using this kind of technology, there should be enough care in completely modifying the platform from raw speech signals to a different domain, and that domain should be used for developing the technology.
Okay, so we should be most worried about there being some kind of appropriation of the raw signal, and once it's in the feature space,
yeah,
you're not worried about it anymore. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now I give the floor to Professor Russell, University of Birmingham, UK.
Esteemed candidate, I'd also like to thank you for an interesting presentation and also for presenting an interesting thesis. In your research, you use several different types of computational model for deep learning. Specifically, you use long short-term memory neural networks and also convolutive neural networks. So my question is why you think those particular computational architectures are particularly appropriate for your particular problem.
Yeah, thank you. So we initially started with using as simple models as possible, which is the CNN models, which would usually get the convoluted idea. I mean, it gives the overall information of what's present in the speech, and then we try to map it with the breathing signal kind of thing. We didn't want to overcomplicate the model so that we don't understand what are we generalizing later into. So that was the main reason why we initially went with, not with any other complicated sequence-to-sequence models, but just the simple CNN and RNN models. And also the reason why we went for LSTM rather than using just a normal RNN is we wanted information that's present in a wider time range to be reflecting in the estimation. So we wanted to go for 8 seconds or even higher time ranges to get better estimation. So if we want to have more temporal information, we need to use LSTMs for that.
So what length of time period do you think is appropriate for your analysis?
We were actually making analysis on 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and 8 seconds. The reason for stopping at 8 seconds is usually when we are conversing, the breathing rate for conversations is around 8 seconds. So that gives almost 8 seconds of time for a person to take the next breath. So we were using 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and 8 seconds. But we later found that 4 seconds is kind of already convenient for better estimation, because longer the time window goes, the computational power also would be higher. So we wanted to have a minimal computation time and then also get the best approximation. Okay. So we could achieve it in 4 seconds.
Did you look in any more detail about what type of analysis these networks are doing to solve your particular problem? So, for example, a convolutional network creates filters on the input patterns. Did you look at the sorts of features that those filters might be trying to detect?
Yeah, we were actually trying to make a cumulative frequency graphs on the first layer of convolutional layers, and we wanted to know which frequency ranges is it actually picking up for the estimation. And we found for log-MEL spectrograms, for example, when you're using log-MEL spectrograms as an input representation, we found that the frequency ranges from below 0 to 4,000 was sufficient for better approximation, better estimation, whereas for raw speech signals, the wider range of frequencies were required for getting better approximation. So we were trying to so we did this cumulative frequency measurements on the first convolutional layer to identify which particular frequencies are being more responsible for better estimation.
So are you saying that the filters are simply looking for energy at particular frequencies, or are they looking for more complex patterns?
We understood that they are looking on frequency-based features more. And also the linguistic content. Apart from the power values as such, it's also looking at the lower frequency range for better estimations.
Okay. Sort of following on from that, you used MEL spectra for your input, and that type of representation is typically used in speech recognition, for example, because we believe that it captures the important features of the speech signal which are relevant for speech recognition. But one could argue, I think, that those are exactly what you don't want if you're trying to analyze the respiratory signal. because the patterns in the spectrogram, for example, will reflect things like articulation. So I wondered why you chose that particular representation for your particular problem.
In a way, we want the articulation information also be visible in the respiratories. I mean, we were trying to establish the relationship, and our assumption is also that mostly the speech signal is going, our models are actually learning the relationship at the level of phoneme. So they are actually learning at the learning on the linguistic content and prosodic factors that I mentioned earlier. So when you have this source system kind of information, trying to model the information based on the perception that gives better estimation. Okay. So that's what was the intuition when we were working towards log-1 spectrograms.
Okay, have we time for one more?
Yes.
Yeah. So one last question, again relating to deep learning. You looked at different dimensions of representation. I think you looked at a relatively compact log spectral representation and also a larger log spectral representation. You concluded that the more compact representation gave you the best performance. Yeah. So my question is that, my question is linked with the fact that you actually seem to have quite limited amounts of training data for your experiments. And I wondered whether the fact that the low dimensional representations give you the best performance reflects their particular suitability for the problem, or simply the fact that with lower dimensional representations you have fewer parameters to estimate?
I think it's because of the low data that we had to go with this. Because we had lesser data, and then we were looking, and also we were trying to compute with the low computational power. So that's the reason we had to choose low representation. We also worked on spectrograms alongside with the log-1 spectrograms. Mm-hmm. We found that, obviously if spectrograms could give better result, but they would need higher epochs and higher computation power, whereas log-1 spectrograms were converging at a very lesser epochs and lesser computation power.
So are you saying that if you'd had more data, for example,
yeah,
then the larger representations would have given better performance?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
In fact, if we can go for raw speech signals as such, we believe that raw speech signals would give the best estimation. If you want to, we were trying to use lower representations to decrease the computation time. Also given that the data is really less. So if we have really huge database, then we can, and really high computation power, the ideal way is to go for raw speech signals, okay, because that would have all the information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Nutt, Friedrich-Alexander Universität Erlangen, Deutschland.
Esteemed candidate, I read your thesis with great interest, and I think it's a really important subject that you touched. I would like to discuss with you the chapter 4, the underlying relationship of phoneme level analysis. So the question is, if you have the phonemes and you looked at basically the place and the manner of articulation, it is clear that, for instance, for a fricative, you use more turbulent air to come out than, for instance, for a nasal or so. So my question is, what is the information that you gain when you look at the delta values and you say, okay, for this fricative, for this phoneme class, he loses so much air, so to speak, and for this one so much. What is the medical motivation behind looking at the different places and manners of articulation?
Okay, so there are certain medical conditions for sure wherein a person has a problem with a particular broad phonetic class, for example, or based on the location. For example, people with dysarthria have a problem with the bilabials. So if we know how much of respiratory effort is required for them, and if we can try to make the person understand and let him also try to replicate the same way, that would actually be a benefit for him to also learn how to make it better. Apart from that, we've also seen that an interesting application would be for people who have a different language who are trying to learn a secondary language. for them, certain phonemes are maybe not included in the language, and they might not know how much respiratory effort is required for pronouncing a particular phoneme, for example. So for them also, this would be like a vocal training so that they can actually pronounce better, kind of thing. So these are some kind of medical applications that they can have.
I can see these medical applications. My question was more, what about the breathing? I mean, the subject of your thesis was not dysarthria. I agree and totally agree that for a dysarthric person, a hard plosive is very hard to pronounce. But where is the connection to the breathing problem?
Okay, the intention for this study is because in our modeling, we were always assuming that the breathing information is coming at the level of, based on the linguistic content and prosodic fact. So when I say linguistic content, it's again, basically we are assuming the model is a equation of different phonemes with weights equivalent to the amount of A that's required for that particular phoneme. So we wanted to know whether that's actually true when we have a respiratory signal. Can we actually see that there's a difference for different phonemes or phoneme classes, or based on the location from where the source is coming? So yeah, this was more this was actually to prove that the models can learn such kind of information, because the information is actually there in speech.
So if you were to redo your experiments again, so to speak, would you say, great, we can ignore the phonemes, or great, by looking at the phoneme classes, we can gain more information about the patient?
I agree with the second one. If we know that, if we have a classified study of how it's actually going at a basic level, then that could be useful for the patients.
Could you gain information that you wouldn't have out of the medical history? I mean, if you know the person is calling to a call center, and you do some medical checkup, you probably already have the person's data. The person is 60 years old, is a smoker, is a non-smoker, all the kind of related problems. So what would you? I'm still waiting, looking for an example where you say, now if you give me that information that for fricatives he behaves like that, that will be additional.
That's a motivation for that. That's not an application that we are trying to address in this particular chapter. It was more like a theoretical explanation for what's happening in the breathing rate kind of thing. But one possible, like I mentioned, the possible outcomes of this in the medical domain could be if you already see that a person is having trouble in pronunciating something, or as simple as children while learning a language, if they are not sure of how much effort they need for pronouncing something, then we can, maybe the coach could already understand how they are supposed to get trained based on this information. So which might need more breadth for completing the word or something like that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Professor De Bot, Universitair Ziekenhuis Antwerpen, België.
Esteemed candidate, my congratulations with your research. I was delighted by the way you combine speech signals and breathing signals to analyze them together in a system, and I believe we can learn a lot, because even for speech pathology, which is my domain, we guess a lot, but we know few about the things behind the speech about breathing. Good. The technology you used is for clinicians quite new and unknown, so I don't really understand what happens in the machine you use. But anyway, what I understand is that the samples you use as input in your system are of main importance. That is for all the basic material you're working on. As long as I have been working with acoustics and with engineers that process the speech signals, I learned that the variability of the samples I collected was immense, and there were a lot of variables: environmental noise, bad monitoring of loudness, the different sample lengths, I can give you a lot of them more, but so the sample condition determines what you can do with it. So we always were trained to have more, better, and with a good control, monitored speech samples. In the way you work, and I see even for the future perspective you design, you say it should be possible by a phone call, and all that conditions that I had in my mind fall away: environmental noise, microphone distance, microphone type, everything is dropped. Samples are used like they come, and the type of sample is spontaneous speech or what they say, casual speech. So it's not designed before. So it can be different for any patient, what he says, or person, what he says or what he does. That's something that concerns me a lot. Maybe I'm too concerned, because putting a lot of conditions on sampling means that maybe the sample is not representative anymore for that patient. If I ask 10 conditions, maybe it's not representative. But okay, my question is does it make sense to create a number of sample conditions to keep the samples within certain conditions, or is it completely irrelevant for the technology you use? And the question is, what you collect, is that representative for the patient, and is it representative enough to detect the problem you want to detect?
Okay. So we've first focused on the generic population. I mean, we want to create a technology wherein it's not subjective to a particular condition or a particular person. So the obvious choice we went for is for healthy volunteers, wherein we can actually model a relation between speech and respiration. However, I mean, this could be extended for other diseases if you have the data from those particular diseases, or as you're mentioning, if it's in a different environment with a lot of noise or uncontrolled kind of setup. Our data was completely, or our modeling is completely on controlled kind of environment. So in order to at least get the technology right, we kind of had the controlled environment with healthy volunteers. But when environment with noisy background or something like that also happens, other researchers or other fields are actually concentrating on getting cleaner signal from this noisy environment, for example, and then our technology could be an cap over this, and then we get some information. But if you ask me whether it should, if you ask me whether this technology could be used for all diseases at once, then maybe not. Yeah. We have to have specified recordings for a particular condition, try to understand what are the pathological aspects for the disease, and maybe get breathing information centered around this pathological condition.
Okay, and the second part was what is representative, what is typical or particular for a patient, a sample, to be good enough to know what you want to know. It's a real concern. It's a real concern of me.
So one way of comparing this is, for example, if you have a measured breathing pattern from a person who's actually having a disease, and then we already create a generic model wherein we know how a healthy person should have actually had the breathing rate for a particular conversation. Then we can actually compare these breathing patterns and say how much is the declination or how bad is the person going. That would be one easy way of using our research into.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Dr. Van Son, Nederlands Kankerinstituut.
Esteemed candidate, I too want to congratulate you with this interesting and innovative thesis. I was particularly endeared by chapters 5 and 6, where you try to apply your method of health sensing on speech, on mild dyspnea and COPD. These are very relevant clinical conditions. In chapter 5, you use a deep neural network to evaluate the dyspnea. And in chapter 6, you show that the breathing signal can be used to evaluate COPD, probably an equivalent to the machine learning approach you used. Now, the breathing signal is much easier to understand than the output of a deep neural network, which is basically a black box. Now, how do you think the breathing signal would compare to the deep neural network when evaluating dyspnea?
That's a good question, but we were trying to detect mild dyspnea, wherein if you actually listen to the recordings, maybe they are not so different, but still we want to segregate them and try to understand whether there's actually a difference between the two speech recordings, kind of thing. So the application, as I mentioned, it's more like if you have a longitudinal tracking of a condition, and if you have speech signals at different points, then can we say if we just move to the next point whether with the subtle difference, can we already see whether it's improving or declining in condition? Whereas in the second case, in COPD, we had real data of COPD people having stable condition and exacerbation condition. For that, there was a clear difference in the breathing rate. Also hearing, we could already hear that there's a lot of respiratory discomfort when a person with exacerbation is talking. So that breathing rate then made sense when we actually heard that difference. But in this case, it was mostly not so. It was not very. It was not very easy to understand which was good and which was bad.
Okay, yes, but it leads to my more general question, because you refer to that in chapter 5 in your introduction, that many people use a lot of classical phonetical acoustical measures and for studying dyspnea, and in the COPD case you did yourself do this kind of classical measurement. And now we know that deep neural networks are very good at doing some things, but we don't know how they do it and we can't interpret it, and we're generally puzzled why this result was coming out. And if you have classical measures like the breathing signal that are more transparent, often people just prefer the ones they understand over the ones they don't. So I would like to ask you, under what circumstances you think such deep neural networks actually would outperform, not only so much that we would prefer to use them instead of these classical measures?
If there's not a defined way of showing, defined way of evaluating a condition, for example, that's when I guess just having a classification kind of problem in deep neural networks, that solves the problem. Whereas if you can actually have an evaluation metrics which makes sense in the physiological world, then something wherein you get back and try to understand which features are really important would make sense. So,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. I now give the floor to Dr. van Helvoort.
Esteemed candidate, also my congratulations for this thesis and your presentation, very clear, and nice to read what you did with some of the pilot data that we gathered long time ago already. And I want to discuss with you a little bit chapter number 6 on the application because of my clinical background, of course. So I am wondering if we can discuss a little bit more about how in the future you see, gathering or diagnosing or helping, for example, the COPD patients with this analysis. So can you maybe, if you have enough money from a grant without any limits, design for me a study in which you can gather new data from new patients and on the way that you want, with the most promising data for exacerbations or stable disease or whatever, that you can help this patient. So just a little bit dreaming, what can we do with it later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that's clearly lacking is mostly we have data when the problem is visible. So when a person is actually suffering, we try to treat them, make them stable, and that's when we have the data. But imagine wherein we have steps of diseases from the very beginning, wherein we can actually spot out some earlier symptoms rather than waiting until it actually deteriorates and then finding a solution. I think that would be a wonderful step. So for that, maybe not a direct way of, maybe using just conversational agents around us, which are like already having all our data being saved, and then after a while we get to know that we had a disease, and then like when we have this longitudinal data, then maybe we can construct more models to understand which particular stage are we in. Or maybe we can also realize that we had a problem just by the tap of your phone, for example. That one thing that's clearly lacking is having that whole data from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, I agree that, of course, we would like to have some longitudinal data and not the other way around as we did in the pilot. So the patient already had an exacerbation, and then we look the other way around and see the recovering. Another question that I have is, if you think in future and you are talking about a call center or whatever, and maybe I can even think a little bit further that we don't need the call center anymore, but just, some kind of chat robot or whatever that the patient can talk to, and then that thing will give you some advice as a patient, what can I do? So I skip the telemonitoring for the call center, but just do it in the home environment of the patient. But then I'm wondering, if I'm going that far, what do we need for these kind of patients with the signals? Because most of these patients are, a little bit older, not the youngest one, and they also, as you showed in your presentation, don't have the highest social economic status. So is it possible to do that kind of things in these patients?
I mean, definitely if we have already all the data that we want at different stages, irrespective of which place or which, now, for example, everyone has a mobile irrespective of their economic situation. So if we have data from the phones, for example, who are willing to give the data at different conversational platforms, then if we can actually collect this data and also get to know their medical history, then we can build models wherein we can, we can see that we can maybe detect earlier symptoms of a person by just having this data already. And that could be used in any geographic location, and that's how we can use in any geographic location.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Well, I'm wondering a bit, because if I see the patients just here in the clinic, then these patients with COPD, they are already now complaining if they have to do some digital things and whatever on. So I'm wondering if you can do it in all places over the world with this kind of fancy method. So I'm a little bit doubtful that we do have some problems with that, but maybe we can discuss that later on.
I also think, it also depends on how the people are waiting for the technology to actually help them. Or for example, in the case of COVID-19 speech, the people were willing to already give the data and help us to actually create some technology for them. So I think it depends on the willingness of the people and the importance of the problem that they're facing.
Yeah, I think that most of the patients are willing to do that, but imagine that you have an 85-year-old patient that's not seeing all the signals on the phone, and he has to tell something to that. So I'm wondering if every patient is able to do it, and not even if he's want to do it, whether or not. But that are future plans, and not for now. Do we have time for one more question or not? Okay. Well, then I will go with you. Also in chapter 6, I read that the estimated breathing rate is used as parameter to observe the difference between the stable and the exacerbated condition of the COPD patients. And then I was wondering if you are focusing on breathing rate, just from speech, of course. It seems quite complex to use speech analysis if you only are focused on breathing rate. Do I really need this complex analysis to just have information about breathing rate? Can we do it a little bit easier, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, just the breathing rate may not be the, coin toss of example. So I think a breathing rate with tidal volume, how much air are they having when having utterance, and also how much time are they having, how much is the inhalation movement, for example, and exhalation movement, for example. I think people having respiratory problems take higher inhalation movements, and usually the exhalation movements are much shorter. So if you can have these kind of parameters, then it's much more easier to define which is with COPD or which is not. But I agree, just on the breathing rate, it's not evident as such.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to a very efficient exchange of ideas, questions, and answers, we have, I think, 15 minutes for a second round of questions. And I would like to start with the colleagues from abroad. Professor Russell, a second question.
Esteemed candidate, my second question relates to what I asked you originally, and also to what my colleague asked. I'm interested in how different speech sounds contribute to the ability to detect the breathing patterns. So you were given a corpus of data which you didn't design. If you had to design material for a subject to read in order to optimize your ability to detect their breathing patterns, what types of sounds and what types of syntactic structures would you incorporate in that corpus?
Okay. So we've actually collected data at Philips, wherein we had 40 healthy volunteers, and we had different protocoled speech tasks. One thing was a read speech, wherein we had a phonetically balanced paragraph, which is the rainbow paragraph. It's a long paragraph, at least 3 minutes, having all combinations of phonemes. So that was actually our base database that we had. Apart from that, we also had conversations with people just talking about how the day went through or how the weekend went through. So these were more like a spontaneous speech that we also had.
But using a phonetically balanced set, that suggests that you think all phones are equally important for detecting breathing patterns.
At least having a relation between each of the phoning with the breathing pattern is important if you want to model each and every sound that we are hearing around. So we were trying to have those combinations at least present in the paragraph. So for example, if you just have one line being repeated too many times, that may not have the entire information of what the language has. So again, maybe this paragraph is not the ideal way, but it's mostly used in every other speech related research.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Professor Nut Friedrich Alexander Universität.
Esteemed candidate, I would like to come to chapter 5 and ask a question on the detection of mild dyspnea from pairs of speech recordings. Now, in your setup, you could say, okay, record that speech, then do some practice, and then record again. That's great for an experiment, but in real life, if you wanted to use that knowledge, you wouldn't always have 2 recordings in a short time. So my question is, what is your estimate? How far could you go back? Would you say, if I have a recording of that person from 2 days ago, that's okay, or if I have it from 2 months ago, or if it's more than 2 months, I can't use it anymore. I mean, the question is, if you gain that knowledge with this experimental setup, what is your personal estimate? Voices change. So, and it could be certain effects where you say, okay, I see a difference, but that difference is actually for some other reason. So what is your estimate? And can you do that by saying, I don't care what he recorded last week. All I say is, if I want to look at it, just read this text, and I can still compare with the other recording.
I think clearly there's not any definitive time period to evaluate or something like that. But if you have, the question we were trying to solve here is, if we have 2 similar kind of speech recordings which have very little varying kind of sound, we wanted to know whether it's improving or declining. I mean, it maybe not depending on the time frame as such, but based on the speech or utterance in that particular recording. So in our case, for example, what we actually did is we had this healthy volunteers. We tried to make them do some exercise. They got exhausted, but it was not just the exhaustion. I mean, if you get exhausted, you start speaking, and by the end of 1 or 2 minutes, they were already in a stable condition. So we actually had a longitudinal data starting from very exhaustive to a normal kind of speech. So here we were trying to compare different segments of speech and see whether I can say this is better or this is worse kind of thing. So maybe not directly dependent on the time frame as such, but seeing how much degree of improving or worsening is it happening.
But if you find differences, then you still have to say, I can say that these differences are caused by. But in your experiment in chapter 5, you had 2 recordings and you found differences. Obviously, because the person was doing exercises. But if you can't have that experimental setup, do you still think you can do that kind of comparison to gain medical information?
Even in our recordings, it's not completely binary as such, right? It's not person who is completely exhausted and then who is completely healthy. It's more about the range of being completely exhaustive and then slowly calming down. So that kind of also is something that we see in a person with a condition too, right? We see different stages of a person with a condition, and if we can compare side by side, in our case, if it's over exhaustive to a little bit less exhaustive, if we can see that there's already a difference, that could also extend to other kind of scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I give the floor to Professor De Bot, Universitair Ziekenhuis Antwerpen.
Esteemed candidate, coming back to your chapter 4 too, like others here, members of the jury did, and I was attracted by the concept of respiratory effort parameters. Because it's completely new for me. Even when I work many times in the field, I never met this concept. So I looked for the variables you use, and I checked the references you use. You use one reference that is not related with speech really, but finally you select lung volume change and LVC rate, and you say these are my variables for respiratory effort parameters. My question is there some consensus about these variables, and has formal research been done about this, or did you select them yourself to explore in this research? What is the validity of these measures related to speech, more specifically on phoneme production? And just as a comment, my intuition says that if you want to know something about regulation of breath related to phoneme production, the glottic control has a lot of importance too, maybe more than lung volume changes. And would maybe airflow measurements not have been better to relate with this type of research? Maybe it's a little bit outside of the concept, but I would like to know your opinion about this.
So these parameters were completely coined by us. We had a respiratory signal, and then we wanted to quantify what could be the difference between one particular phoneme and the other. And out of the signal we have, we were trying to quantify them.
Yeah, but you go too fast for me. So the variables were available from your assessment of the patients.
Yeah, we coined the terms, and then we were defining the terminology.
Okay, and you want to explore them?
Yeah, we wanted to explore them. We wanted to have a way to quantify different exhaustions for different phonemes. So from the signal we had the measured breathing signal. From that, the only thing we could compute is what is the difference of the breathing signal. So that we kind of assume that difference of the breathing signal could actually be the lung volume change, because it's actually measuring the change of.
Are they representative for you?
Yeah, just for us.
And what do you think about airflow measurements related to speech production?
We didn't have airflow measurements. We didn't record them. This was basically, we already had the speech and
well, I understand. So finally, after this research, can you conclude or can you recommend to use these two parameters for what you call respiratory effort parameters, or respiratory effort, to express and quantify respiratory effort? That is very interesting for clinicians.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you can just have a setup wherein the person has a wearable kind of belt, and then if you can see the difference in it, that would be...
Okay, I understand, but is it valid enough to use with the research you did? Would you recommend it to me to say it's something you have to do when you want to know respiratory effort related to speech? You can do this. That is what clinicians hope to hear. Maybe it's not ready to, but then I want to hear it from you.
I think it's ready to use, because I've also seen, I mean, while I was investigating on this, there were certain references wherein people were saying if you use spirometry, for example, that might not directly be, that could add some more volume, and then the lung volume changes is not really appropriate. Whereas if you have a measurable belt which is seeing the expansion and contraction, that could be more accurate kind of thing.
And did you apply it on other categories than phonemes only?
Only on phonemes.
No.
What do you mean by that?
You use it now for the phonemes. Mm-hmm. Did you use it on broader samples? On?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I now give the floor to Professor Larsson, Chair of the Manuscript Committee.
Esteemed candidate, I'd like to follow up on a discussion that we had a while ago. I believe I heard you make the statement that depending on what kind of respiratory health issue that you would like to detect or diagnose, you need to have a different recording. Did I understand you correctly? And could you elaborate on that statement?
I mean, if you are recording if you are recording speech of a person, and if it's for different conditions, then if you want to model a particular detection of a particular condition, we need a database on that particular disease. For example, if you are modeling something on COVID-19 speech, maybe it can't be directly...
Does the recording, sorry to interrupt you, but my question was, does the recording setup need to be different?
No.
Okay.
It's the same.
Thank you. So do you see as a future something that we have on social media, that some school districts are concerned about the mental health of their students, so they monitor what the students type on social media in order to try to anticipate problems? Do you see that happening in the future, that we monitor some kind of maybe YouTube or other spoken social media in order to identify people that have problems and let them know that they have problem, that you would just get an email, hey, I listened to your video lecture and I'm worried that you have some particular COPD or some other problem?
That's what we are aiming at. Our vision is to have such kind of platforms in the future.
Okay, so who's we in this case?
The researchers involved in speech pathology, for example, or anyone who is a speech researcher. We want to have low resource kind of platforms, and then try to identify what problems a person has without even them knowing, and then telling them giving insights for them how to have a better life.
Okay. So maybe making the loop back to the initial question. So how do we work the informed consent into that particular vision that you just sketched?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Maybe on the open source related videos, for example, on like the way you explained earlier on YouTube or something, we could already try to de-identify the person, use some masks so that we can remove the speaker information and then just use the pathological information that we get from the speech, and then use them. For example, in our case, breathing signal could be estimated from speech, and maybe breathing signal could be a way of a pathological indicator rather than using speech as such. Similarly, for other kind of diseases also, maybe we can move into a different domain wherein we can't directly identify the person, and have a platform wherein we create all kinds of solutions based on the secondary.
Okay. So then, maybe to push you a little bit towards the future, because indeed this is a very future-looking thesis, very important topic. So these discussions are important. How do you resolve the problem of wanting to alert somebody to possible problems, and also the need for a de-identification of the person, as you just mentioned? How do you resolve these two sort of points that are in tension with each other?
Well,
The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors and co-supervisor, as well as all those who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
Thank you. The doctoral examination board retreats for its deliberations.
Mm.
We have a place to crash it in India, so.
My theory was always that you first want to finish one, but I was once in a committee and we didn't get one, so that's theory is not a trick. That was at some point. Okay.
On behalf of the Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Dr. Strick to discharge the task assigned to him.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Doctorate Board, I hereby confirm upon you, Shrikant Venkata Nalantigal, born in Hyderabad, the title of Doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to the academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma, signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisor and co-supervisor.
And now ask the supervisor, Dr. Strick, to hand over the doctoral diploma. Please take a seat.
What should I talk now?
Yeah. Wait up.
Instead.
The eulogy will be delivered by Dr. Hermer.
Thank you very much. Dear Dr. Nalachigal, dear Srikant, my friend, I have given this privilege of giving a laureate presentation in this session. In terms of your technology or your work, I would say that I will modulate my exhalation for the next 65 expirations with some linguistic content that describes somehow your work, your personality, and our collaboration in these 3-4 years in the past. So this work was done as a part of the TAPAS network, which is Marie Skowalskaya-Curie network on pathological speech processing. So a couple of weeks ago, we had our final event in Antwerp of the network, and all members of the network were there present. You also gave your remote talk there. I must say that we all supervisors of the network, some of them joining the call here, are really proud of these people who, during these COVID times, did their best in finalizing PhD project in this very important topic area, which is in the intersection of human communication and healthcare. So this has been a very important journey for all of us, I believe, and especially for you. I believe that you have found many, many friends in the network at Philips Research, Radboud University, and the TAPAS network over this time. The topic of this thesis, breathing sensing from speech, was kind of with some people that's kind of a little bit like by surprise. So we had other topic in a plan in the first phase, but actually due to problems in accessing data, we ended up doing the work on this topic area, where we started very quickly because of your work in collecting a large data set that we were able to actually use in our study. So the selection of this topic was indeed kind of a quick selection that we made during our discussions, but it was a very fortunate one because it turned out that this topic area has not so much research background, and actually we were able to do quite a pioneering work in this topic on breathing sensing. Also, the timing of selecting this particular topic was very good because that was at the time of rising of the corona disease, which was, of course, brought this problem of respiratory problems to everyone's lips, so to speak. So breathing problems was there in the popular discussion, and actually we added that almost to every paper in the introduction, already references to the COVID already from the very beginning of that. So this has been good. We all have seen that actually you have not been saved completely from the COVID. Actually, I cannot even count how many times you had COVID during this period. But fortunately, this didn't slow us down. There was nothing breathtaking for you in COVID, I would say. Actually, what was breathtaking was your hair. your Indian dance moves and your jump from airplane. So this is breathtaking side of this work. And of course, it's excellent work, which I think is a pioneering work in this topic area of speech healthcare science. So we really did something first. We are already seeing that there are people following your footsteps, doing research in the same topic area. I believe this was pioneering important contribution to the healthcare speech science. So we are also very happy that you are able to continue this work, because there's still many, many programs to study. So this is, I would say, only very good start for an important research career in healthcare speech science. Thank you very much.
Alantigal. On behalf of the Council of Deans, I would like to congratulate you, your parents, your friends and colleagues, other members of the family here and other parts of the world who are attending this session by live stream. I would like to close the ceremony with a prayer in Latin. I ask you to stand up. Gratias tibi agimus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum. A reception for the new doctor will be held below. We leave in procession with the registrar leading and the new doctor amongst us, followed by the supervisors and the members of the examination board. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence here during the ceremony.